Hello, everyone. My name is Lopez Matthews, and I'm here representing ASALH TV. I would like to welcome you to the 30th Annual Early E. Thorpe Memorial Lecture, featuring Dr. Marcus P. Nevius. We will begin today with a brief video presentation from North Carolina Central University, followed by a welcome from Dr. Jerry Gershenhorn.
This is our history.
This is our legacy.
This is NCCU's History Department.
This is North Carolina Central University's Department of History.
Welcome to the 30th Annual Early E. Thorpe Memorial Lecture. My name is Jerry Gershenhorn. I'm a professor of history at NCCU, North Carolina Central University, and it has been my privilege to help organize this lecture series in recent years in honor of the trailblazing historian Early E. Thorpe. We taught at NCCU for 27 years, published many landmark historical works, and left a huge legacy through his mentoring of so many students who have become fine historians in their own right. Thanks to the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and particularly Dr. Lopez Matthews, digital production librarian at Howard University Libraries and the Moreland Spingarn Research Center, and also to NCCU's Dr. Jim Harper and Ms. Janae Jones for their work in organizing this year's online event. And we're very pleased that Dr. Marcus Nevius, a graduate of the BA and MA programs in history at NCCU, is this year's speaker. Before we get to Marcus's talk, we'll hear from several Eagles who will bring greetings. Following those greetings, we'll hear from Emeritus Professor of History, Dr. Percy Murray, who will talk for a few minutes about Dr. Thorpe, followed by Emeritus Professor of History, Dr. Freddie Parker, who will introduce today's speaker. Following Dr. Nevius's talk, we'll have time for a Q&A. So now we'll hear first from Dr. Carlton Wilson, Dean of the College of Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities at NCCU, followed by Dr. Jim Harper, Chair of the NCCU Department of History, and then Ms. Brittney Reeves, President of the Early E. Thorpe Graduate Student Historian Society. Dr. Wilson.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jerry. I'm Carlton Wilson, Dean of the College of Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities at North Carolina Central University. And on behalf of the college and the entire university community here at NCCU, I welcome you to the annual Early Thorpe Memorial Lecture. I hope all of you are safe and well on this beautiful fall afternoon in Durham, North Carolina. I'd like to extend a special welcome to all of our students, alumni, our viewers on ASALH television. Thank you for being here. And of course, a good eagle welcome to Dr. Marcus Nevius, who's returning to the nest today to deliver the annual Early E. Thorpe Memorial Lecture. We wish you could be here at North Carolina Central University on our beautiful campus. However, we are grateful and pleased to be able to present the Early E. Thorpe Memorial Lecture through this virtual format and on ASALH television. It is extremely important to continue this event, a tribute to a pioneer, an icon, to an eagle, a person who mentored students as he cultivated important areas in the study of African American, American, and intellectual history. Dr. Thorpe bestowed upon us many gifts, his mind, his work. All of that could not be pigeonholed. In many ways, Dr. Thorpe was the quintessential intellectual. As a student in one of his seminar classes, which wasn't that long ago, I recall studying European history, intellectual history, and at the end of each class, Dr. Thorpe would reach into an old paper bag and pull out a book. The book could be written by E.P. Thompson, it could be Hegel, it could be Marx, it could be Frantz Fanon. He would pull out a couple of books and he would put them on my desk And he said, just read that and let's talk. That was the mind of early Thorpe. That is what he bestowed upon all of his students, to read, to think, to discuss as we attempt to understand our historical past. So we are tremendously grateful for Dr. Thorpe's presence at North Carolina Central University. His legacy continues to live. And we are especially thankful to the Thorpe family for allowing all of us to share time with Dr. Thorpe. We greatly appreciate you. We hope that you continue to join us, not only on this day, but at any time as we continue the legacy of early Thorpe. Once again, welcome everyone. Special thank you to ASALH Television, and we hope that you enjoy today's lecture. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim C. Harper II, Chair and Professor of History in the Department of History at North Carolina Central University. I bring you greetings on behalf of the faculty, students, and staff of the Department of History for the 30th Annual Early E. Thorpe Lecture Series. We're proud to have one of our very own, Dr. Marcus Nevius, a double eagle, to serve as our keynote speaker. This lecture series is an important part of the activities that our students and faculty engage in each year to present scholarly historical research to our university, local and state communities, as well as to scholars and friends of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. This year is no different. Many of you know that the Department of History has had a long and committed affiliation with the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Our faculty and students have attended and presented at annual conferences, as well as served on the Executive Council. Dr. Early E. Thorpe served as the president of the association from 1981 to 1982. As such, I would like to thank the Association for the Study of African American Life and History for partnering with us to host this lecture series by live streaming this event on ASALH TV and the ASALH Facebook page. I'd like to thank each of you for joining us on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Brittney Reeves, and I am the president of the E.E. Thorpe Historian Society here at North Carolina Central University, and I'm extremely honored to be here with all of you guys today. I am at my first E.E. Thorpe lecture, and I did not know much about E.E. Thorpe before attending North Carolina Central University. But through my professors and peers in the program, I've learned that E.E. Thorpe dedicated his life and his academic career to imparting wisdom and knowledge into students for over 27 years. And I appreciate all that he has done for blazing a trail for Black historians and Black intellectuals. And I am greatly honored to be a part of a program where another Eagle will be leading our lecture today. So thank you, Mr. Nevius, for coming to share this knowledge with us. And I hope that everybody takes the time to learn about E.E. Thorpe, and in this very unprecedented time, take some of the values and morals that he had and apply it to your own academic careers or your own lives today. So thank you all for joining us.
Good afternoon. This is Percy Murray, Professor Emeritus now from the Department of History and Social Science at North Carolina Central. I've been retired for the last 10 years. And at the end of this month, had things been like they were in many years before, I would be celebrating my 50th golden anniversary year from having graduated from the Department of History at North Carolina Central and North Carolina Central University. But as we have it, we will not have a Golden Eagle ceremony, but we will still be able to say we were 50 years ago students at North Carolina Central. I would say I came to North Carolina Central in 1966, and not as a history major, but as a person majoring in mathematics. But I did, by the end of my freshman year, gain some knowledge and got out of math and ended up in history. So let me share some thoughts about my mentor colleague and, of course, friend, Dr. Earlie E. Thorpe. These are some things I have noted here about him, just to give you a sense of his background, and then a few other things, and I will not take all of the time. I have here Earlie Thorpe, of course, was a historian, philosopher, and a teacher, and was a mentor to many young African-American undergraduate and graduate students, first at North Carolina College at Durham, and later North Carolina Central University. For most of his career, he taught history and chaired the Department of History at North Carolina Central. The young Thorpe entered North Carolina College for Negroes during World War II and was drafted to serve in the Army. He left college willingly, as did so many other young men of his generation. He joined the segregated Army and served a tour of duty in Europe. He was married before leaving Durham to his lifelong sweetheart, Martha Vivian Branch, and they, at the time, had 2 young children as he departed for his tour of duty. In his letters to Martha Vivian, he wrote of his experiences while stationed in Arizona and the cultural changes he observed while traveling into Mexico in 1944. He found the people to be fascinating and the women to be appealing, yet he confessed his undying love for his young wife and bride and assured her that he was not interested in the ladies of Mexico. His writings to his wife are illustrative of Thorpe's passion for writing. And if you get a chance, his manuscript collection is at Duke University. Not many of those letters are there because Mrs. Thorpe, unless she's put them there since I last looked at this, she has not shared those personal letters with the public yet. Be interested in reading all those letters that they wrote during those years. He was born here in the city of Durham as a twin to a family of what we call laborers. He would pursue history while his twin brother pursued medicine. He attended the public schools here in this city. And after service in World War II, he returned to complete his bachelor's and master's degrees at North Carolina College for Negroes. He would be a student at the college founded by James E. Shepard, and upon his return would learn of Shepard's death. His professors included the renowned John Hope Franklin, Helen Gray Edmonds, Leroy Walker, and Francis Newton in English. His interest and love for history was further fostered under the tutelage of Franklin and Edmonds. Edmonds' influence was so great that he would follow her recommendation and enroll at The Ohio State University to pursue the PhD degree in history. Of Thorpe, the student, both John Hope Franklin and Helen Gray Edmonds have commented that they have taught very few students with his ability. Professor Franklin remarked, quote, that one did not teach Earlie, you learn from him, end of quote. Learning from him seemed to be everyone's style. He taught with such vigor, as you've heard from Dr. Wilson, and vitality that students marveled at his seemingly untiring manner and stamina for staying with the job until it was completed. For a class that would end at 9 o'clock, sometimes it would be 11 o'clock when we got out at night. His pursuit of scholarly articles and books are a testament to his understanding of the need to study African-American history. We focus on his contributions by having this lecture series, or have focused on it for the last 30 years. He was a pioneer in many ways as a historian. He refused to be sidetracked by the standards of the profession by waiting to have manuscripts evaluated by his peers before publishing them. He was relentless in his pursuit of the study of psychohistory and did not rest until he had tied most events to the various areas of psychology. I would say as a side, oh, how we need him today. He impressed upon his students the importance of being well-read and integrating all of the arts and sciences in their scholarship and continuing their education by going on to graduate and professional schools. He wrote numerous letters of recommendations for his students to assist them in gaining admission to schools and finding employment. He was there even until the end to help his students complete their MA degrees. He often commented on the fact that in the end, you had to write many of the master's theses that you were advising. He used the master's oral examination as his last chance to teach budding historians about their craft, and always reminded the women of the importance of keeping their composure during these exams. His questions on the department's written exams would take an entire day to answer, and still most students felt that they had not responded well enough to pass the exam. As we look over the life of Dr. Thorpe, as I've said, his papers, many of his papers are at the Duke University, in Duke University Library in the manuscript collection. You can see aspects of the life, including family, friends, high school classmates, college classmates, former students and colleagues, where he worked. All of these things are important to showing the fullness of Thorpe and the widespread interest he had in history and mankind. As we continue to look at his life and have interest in his life, we ought to remember that he chronicled African-American history. He was a pioneer in many areas. He not only lectured about them, again, he wrote about them. We're still trying in 2020 to understand Dr. Thorpe, who was a complex individual, understand many of the things he wrote about. We're even trying to understand why he wrote about some of the topics that he did, because in many eyes, Black scholars did not write about those kinds of things. Lastly, I would say that as we look at Dr. Thorpe and remember this occasion, we have a first-year student who is president of the E. Thorpe Historian Society. But if we go generational just for a minute, and I'll conclude. I've mentioned that Thorpe was a student of Franklin and Edmonds, who went on to get his PhD. Thorpe came to North Carolina Central in the early 1960s and brought with him one student from Southern University named W. Sherman Jackson, along with many others who were also in the program. Thorpe had a student named Percy Murray, who went on to study with W. Sherman Jackson as his advisor at Miami of Ohio. Murray had a student, many students, one of which is on the program named, two of which are here today I know of, Gershenhorn and Smallwood. So we have a generational impact of early Thorpe, and this generation continues. I was thinking about this even today as I tried to decide how much I would say here in this generational history, get an understanding of. In the 60s, Thorpe came to North Carolina Central. In the 60s, he had 7 of his former students to graduate from Ohio State, 7 to get PhDs within the 60s. One mostly from Ohio State, one from Missouri, and one from none other than the University of South Carolina. And then there's the 70s, professors like George Reed. I can name many of them. Then there are the 80s, and I'm a 70s PhD, but I'm an 80s, and I came to work at North Carolina since 1979. What I'm saying here is there's a continuation. I even thought about the class of 1970, of which, you know, most recently we lost one of our beloved members and history professors, Beverly Washington Jones. Beverly Washington Jones was one of Dr. Thorpe's pride and joys as a student. Also Beulah Rhodes, who ended her career at Albany State. But Thorpe's legacy is one of which we marveled at his intellectual pursuits. I have several of his books here in the house, and what I enjoy about them is not the content of the books, but the notes in the margins. The notes in the margins are just life-telling. Yeah. I have before me here in my makeshift office is a folder before I came to North Carolina Central in 1979 as chair. I received a letter from Dr. Thorpe every day for 365 days. Here it is 2020, and I still have those handwritten letters from Dr. Thorpe. Folders and folders of them. Every day he wrote and told me what was going on in the history department and what I had to look forward to, of which we're not here to discuss. But again, this is an occasion where we want to make certain that all of us understand the impact of such a scholar in history, second to none, and we continue his legacy through Dr. Nevius today as he makes his presentation. Dr. Nevius, Dr. Thorpe said that one should write about the common man. One should find out what it is that they're thinking. And we hope that, and we know that you all are, this new generation of historians are looking at many of the issues that they face common people in today's society. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. My name is Freddie Parker, and I'm happy to be here today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Marcus Nevius. But Dr. Murray brought back a lot of memories. I had the opportunity to have 8 courses with Dr. Thorpe at the BA and MA levels. So I'm definitely a Thorpe student. And I'll go ahead now and introduce Marcus. Marcus was a student of most of us. And I served as his master's thesis, so I know a little bit about him. Dr. Nevius is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Rhode Island, where he teaches courses in the history of slavery, the Revolution, Confederation, and early Republican periods in the early United States, and in the history of African Americans in the early American Republic. He is the author of his most recent publication, City of Refuge, Slavery and Petite Marronage in the Great Dismal Swamp, 1763 to 1856, and that was published this year by the University of Georgia Press. He has published an essay in History Compass, and he has published book reviews in the Journal of African American History, the Journal of Southern History, and HNet Civil War. He is a recipient of research fellowships granted by the Special Collections Research Center of the Earl Gregg Swim Library at the College of William and Mary, Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. Dr. Nevius holds the BA and MA degrees in history from North Carolina Central University and the PhD in history from the Ohio State University. Currently on fellowship hosted by the Smith Library, he is presently revisiting an article manuscript that examines the informal slave economy of the Dismal Plantation during the American Revolutionary era, through the letters penned by the agents of the late 18th century Dismal Swamp Company. I present and introduce to you Dr. Marcus Nevius.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so very much, Dr. Parker, for such a humbling introduction. City of Refuge, I would be remiss to note, was in fact begun as my master thesis under your direction and inspired in my time at North Carolina Central University. So in some ways, my very first book owes a great deal to my time in the halls of the Edmonds Classroom Building and roaming about in Durham and other parts of North Carolina. I want to begin with a list of thanks. First to Dr. Gershenhorn and the Department of History for the invitation to deliver the Early Thorpe Memorial Lecture this afternoon. It is a special honor, and indeed an honor that creates a bit of cautious anxiety, I'll say, because of the great weight that this lecture carries in ensuring Dr. Thorpe's legacy, not only for the Department of History, but more broadly, as I'll get into in my talk in a moment, for the history profession and for particularly historians of Black history in the 20th century. I'd like to thank Ms. Janae Jones as well for helping to organize this talk, Mr. Lopez Matthews and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History for ensuring that this talk could debut on ASALH TV. Of course, Dean Wilson and Professor Murray and Ms. Reeves for all of your work in continuing the legacy of Dr. Thorpe and this lecture. And a special thanks to Dr. Thorpe's family for sharing Dr. Thorpe with North Carolina Central University as long as you did, and for ensuring, even in his wake, that his legacy goes on through the excellent work that North Carolina Central University's Department of History puts forward. I'm going to share my screen now to begin with a PowerPoint that I hope will guide my reflections today. If I don't do this, I tend to be long-winded and I will certainly go off the rails here, but in very good ways, sharing my own memories of my experience at North Carolina Central University, which I'm happy to share in the discussion period after the lecture. I'm calling this talk Reflections on the History of Black Resistance, with a particular subtitle, Implications for Scholarship in the 21st Century. And I'd like to take a moment here first to sort of make plain what I mean by reflections on the one hand and implications on the other. I think it vitally important for us as scholars in the 21st century to ground our scholarship in part in a deep reflection of the history of Black resistance, not only as an academic subject, but also more particularly as the experiences of Black scholars in the 20th century and others, their colleagues as well, who labored so wonderfully hard to ensure that these histories could be brought forth in very fraught social and political and economic times in the 20th century. I'm thinking here too of implications in part because the context for scholarship, particularly for the scholarship of slavery and of Black resistance, has changed significantly, now 20 years on into the 21st century. And what I mean very plainly by that is that scholars, Black or otherwise, have many more opportunities to engage in the study of these histories than did our forebears in the 20th century. And so it would be remiss of me here too, not to establish that as a premise for this lecture and to share my deep gratitude to Dr. Thorpe and others who laid a foundation and set forth a path for this great work. I begin here too with the cover of my book, City of Refuge, because it grounds well the story that I seek to bring to bear in City of Refuge. We see here a painting created by David Cronin and finished in 1888. It depicts a Civil War era Maroon community in the Great Dismal Swamp. But I point out a few things here to ensure that we're also grounding our understanding of this history. First, we see a multi-generational group, including an old man here and a baby here, and then a wide range of ages in between. We see here too a depiction of the vigilance that these communities or these groups necessarily had to engage, because if you can see over the shoulder of this particular person and the direction that he's pointing in, we see a column of soldiers, which are most certainly soldiers in the Civil War era, but they're far off from the center of this painting for us not to be able to clearly make out whether or not they are donning Union blues or Confederate grays. And either way, for those who hid in the swamp, to emerge from the swamp, even in the period of the Civil War, was very much a significant risk to be weighed by all, and individually decisions to be made as it related to presenting oneself before passing soldiers. We see here too that this group is well provisioned and well dressed considering their circumstances. Layers of clothing, a vest here, a long sleeve shirt there, slacks here, which are almost certainly cotton Osnaburgs, but they don't appear in this image, at least, to be torn. A dress here, headgear here, the child seemingly clothed as well. And to this end then, I'd like to just point out at this point the complexity of the story that I attempt to engage in City of Refuge, and that I'll return to momentarily in this lecture. I will first begin with the outline for the lecture. I'm going to begin by talking briefly about Dr. Thorpe and about Black history in the 20th century as I engage it in the introduction to City of Refuge and as I learned it in part in my studies at North Carolina Central University. I'll then move to a discussion of City of Refuge, and then I'll turn to the implications for recent scholarship, as I'm aware that there are many who are working on a wide range of projects at various stages of conception. And in this particular section of this lecture today, Implications, I highlight a few recent examples that I am engaging with as I move forward in my work in the study of African-American history. I'll then provide a few final thoughts, and I will also look forward to discussion, robust discussion. Dr. Murray has given us a wonderful perspective on Dr. Thorpe's work at North Carolina Central University. I add to Dr. Murray's biography the article that Dr. Gershenhorn published about a decade ago now in Souls, titled Early Thorpe and the Struggle for Black History, 1949 to 1989. And I admit, at least in thinking about how I might frame this lecture today, I did go back and read Dr. Gershenhorn's great biography of Dr. Thorpe. What I highlight here, in addition to Dr. Murray's wonderful introduction to Dr. Thorpe, are the four main books that Dr. Thorpe became well known for in his time. Black Historians, a Critique, a reprint of its initial debut, Negro Historians in the United States. The two books together, the product of Dr. Thorpe's Ohio State University dissertation. And then three more, The Mind of the Negro, an Intellectual History of African Americans, Eros and Freedom in Southern Life and Thought, and The Old South, a Psychohistory, the titles of which reveal Dr. Thorpe's shift intellectually in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a bit from studies of African American history as a subject and into studies of the ways in which slavery and the circumstances of the 20th century affected the presentation both of African American history and the experiences of African Americans in the 19th century. And indeed, in this stead, Dr. Thorpe was among the earliest of scholars nationwide to engage in the study of psychology as history and history as a reflection of psychology. Indeed, today we would take a look at Dr. Thorpe's work and we would appreciate it, I think, differently, particularly in the thrust for interdisciplinary study and particularly in the emphasis on interdisciplinary study in Africana studies departments throughout the nation. But in his time, and as Dr. Gershenhorn so wonderfully reminds us in this article, it is clear that the study of psychohistory was indeed seen to be fraught with problems, even as Dr. Thorpe himself was an exemplary scholar. And how do we know this? In part, we can take a look at Dr. Thorpe's contemporaries, past and still living. The eminent scholars you see here on the list, in the list on the left, Dr. Mary Frances Berry, for example, Rayford Logan, John Hope Franklin, Benjamin Quarles, to name a few. The two that I've highlighted in gold here, long careers at HBCUs, in part the product of their choice, like Dr. Thorpe, to engage in the production of history and the study of history as Black scholars at historically Black colleges and universities. Others, John Hope Franklin, who becomes perhaps the most eminent scholar of Black history and Black resistance of the 20th century, clearly not only a mentor and a model to Dr. Thorpe, but later, as Dr. Thorpe's career took shape too, a colleague. And as Dr. Gershenhorn reminds us, others with whom Dr. Thorpe engaged as colleagues, either in private letters or in the pages of journals of scholarship, as these scholars together engaged in the projects of evaluating publicly their own work. I think it important to highlight here too, Dr. Thorpe's long history of scholarship and of service at HBCUs, Stowe's Teacher College in the early 1950s, and Alabama A&M College in the early 1950s, to Southern University and North Carolina Central University throughout the balance of his career. The bulk of his career, of course, served at North Carolina Central University from the 1960s until his death in 1989. But I should also point out here too, the year that he spent traveling back and forth on a essentially daily basis, one day a week, between Durham, North Carolina, and Cambridge in Massachusetts to teach a course part-time at Harvard University, particularly as the value of his scholarship became widely known in the academy, but also as his dedication to HBCUs became the balance of his contribution to the academy, the decision, that is to say, in part, to remain at North Carolina Central University, even as he taught part-time at Harvard. Now, why do I think this grounding is important, particularly as someone who has the privilege and the special honor today of delivering a lecture in Dr. Thorpe's name? I think it partly explained by my reflections today of the wonderful scholarship and camaraderie that I engaged at North Carolina Central University as a student in my own right, taught by and mentored by scholars who themselves were acting in Dr. Thorpe's stead. And indeed, as a student, sometimes that sort of intellectual biography is not always present and foremost in your mind, particularly as you're attempting to identify your own topics of interest and as you're attempting to learn to negotiate the skills of the historian as you engage the historian's craft, engaging in the scholarship that is to say, while bringing forth the scholarship of the present and the scholarship of the future. So with that in mind, I turn to a discussion of City of Refuge at this point, at least in part to talk about a project that saw its roots wielded or grounded at North Carolina Central University. The most obvious question, of course, where is the Great Dismal Swamp? Now, for many of you in North Carolina and Virginia, this is an obvious answer, but for our audiences nationwide, in case you're wondering, it was a significant landmass that straddled the border of Virginia and North Carolina. Prior to the Civil War, about 2,000 square miles in area. That is generally reflected by this burnt orange color here, with a much smaller segment of the swamp developed and ultimately preserved after the Civil War. Logging industries wound down in the mid-20th century, and federal and state agencies acquired the remaining wild landscape or semi-wild landscape in the 1970s. Another question that's important to address here: why does its histories of slavery and slave resistance matter? It's interesting to me that in part my efforts in City of Refuge were driven by what Professor Murray mentioned just a little while ago as one of Dr. Thorpe's main lessons. It is important to study the experiences of common people, and as Dr. Thorpe mentioned, the experiences of common man. That was my thrust in City of Refuge mainly. Indeed, City of Refuge brings to bear a host of characters who are widely known for their prominence and legacies in this nation. At the top of that chain, perhaps, is one George Washington himself. And indeed, it's the result of many, many records produced by men, including George Washington and others who animated the companies that used slave labor, that exploited slave labor in the time periods that I study. It's because of the robust communications and correspondences and efforts to capture what was happening in the swamp that we have at least some form of a primary source base to bring to bear in this project. I turn here to a brief image that I captured in May 2013 when I visited the swamp embedded with an archaeological field school out of American University, led by the primary historical archaeologist who has worked in the Great Dismal Swamp, the wonderful Dan Sayers, and his students who have engaged, at least for the past 15 years, in significant efforts to recover also the material record as it remains in the swamp, the artifacts, that is to say, that also can be brought to bear to engage the story of the human history of slavery and Black resistance in the Great Dismal Swamp. But I feature this picture too, because none other than Moses Grandi, in his slave narrative of the 1840s, described his experience of spending almost a year in a form of individual marinage along the shores of this great lake as he struggled with and sought to recover from rheumatism. And so although the landscape we see here in 2013 is quite different than the landscape that Moses Grandi engaged in the 1840s, I think it an interesting way to at least engage in a perspective of what life in one part of the vast landscape of the Great Dismal Swamp could have been like. For what it's worth, City of Refuge is a contribution to the standing historiographies it engages. These are historiographies of slavery and Black resistance on the one hand, and of the early republic and exploitation of slave labor on the other. Both began with my interests in Black resistance and other studies as an undergraduate student at North Carolina Central University. Both grew into an effort to explain why in the early 1850s, Edmund Jackson and other abolitionists began to describe the Dismal Swamp as a city of refuge in the midst of slavery, as I engaged in deeper study of historiographies at my time, or during my time at Ohio State. In the vein of recent scholarship, City of Refuge emphasizes the intertwined histories of European colonization, of Republican state formation, particularly through the efforts of private companies to claim space in the Dismal Swamp, and of slavery, the labor system that undergirded these efforts. But City of Refuge also engages in a grassroots social history of slave labor camp management through the firsthand experiences of white company agents and labor camp overseers. And this in part is one of the important lessons that I think that City of Refuge brings to bear, in part because it's an implication for study in the 21st century, as I'll return to a bit later, but in part also because it's important to remind ourselves too, that scholars, including Earl E. Thorpe, were intimately aware of this level of complexity, even as the stories they wrote and published, and that we remember, are sometimes remembered more for their contributions to the study of Black history and to the politics of Black history in the 20th century than we engage presently. The book is also about an externally exchange economy which involved enslaved people and Maroons on opposite ends of networks of exchange that ensured, in part, that Maroons could lay claim to more remote sectors of the swamp and remain in those sectors of the swamp as long as they saw fit, even as canal and land company agents tacitly accepted these exchanges without seeking to intervene. Marronage, for what it's worth, I see as the most pervasive form of fugitive enslaved community formation, of resistance, of negotiation, and of enslaver accommodation, not only in the history of the Great Dismal Swamp or the early United States, but more broadly, as I've written elsewhere, in the history of the Atlantic world. And indeed, the history of Petite Marronage in the Great Dismal Swamp, a distinction that is important here by comparison to contexts of Grand Marronage, comes to light as a complex human history of slave agency and enslaved laborer guile in negotiating the oppressive terms of slavery in extreme environments that differed significantly from plantations and slave societies elsewhere throughout the Old Dominion and the greater Chesapeake region, or the cotton plantation zones of the New Southwest. In the pure sense, then, the Dismal's Maroons I see as freedom seekers who originated in plantation or swamp slave labor camp contexts and who engaged in Petite Marronage to repudiate altogether slave society. And for this particular reason, the Dismal's history of Petite Marronage cannot be decoupled, or for these reasons in total, the Dismal's history of Petite Marronage cannot be decoupled from its histories of extractive and informal exchange economies, which few scholars to this point do, which is an important highlight in and of itself when we're thinking about implications for study going forward. The book follows the experiences that can be gleaned from the records of the Dismal Swamp Company from 1763 to the early 1810s, and from the Dismal Swamp Land Company from the 1810s until just before the Civil War. 1856 is the cutoff year in my study, but indeed the Dismal Swamp Land Company does continue operation into the Civil War period and did produce records that are worth study in that period as well. The observations of the swamp come from, as I mentioned earlier, men including George Washington and John Augustine Washington, his younger and favorite brother, who managed Dismal Plantation in the 1760s and early 1770s, and later agents, including James Holliday or Samuel Proctor in the early 19th century, but also from the ways in which I can read the silences in the record of people including Edmund Booth, who was an enslaved person whose experience unfolded in the records of the Ore Peak Canal Company at a canal site in Gates County, North Carolina, and demonstrates, at least in a reading of the records, how one enslaved person might find himself free in the early 1850s, only to be enslaved again in that same decade by its close between 1857 and 1859. In seeking refuge in the Dismal's most remote sectors, then, Maroons, of course, it is important to note, did not leave written records. And indeed, this is why new methodologies, including reading the silences of records, reading records both against the grain of what one finds in a direct reading and with the grain of that direct reading, helps us to better frame stories of the experiences of enslaved people, particularly in areas of the Atlantic world where enslaved people's circumstances didn't rise to the level of Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman, who later engaged in writing about their experiences, or had people who became interested enough in their experiences to write about them. And indeed, these methodologies of reading with and against the grain to catch crucial glimpses follow in recent paths that have been forged by scholars including Marisa J. Fuentes, among others. These records are quite interesting and revealing, both at a first glance and then at a second glance in an effort to read silences. What I share here are Dismal Swamp Land Company accounts that were prepared by James Halliday in the 1830s and early 1840s in an effort to apprise company members, as they were known, company shareholders essentially, of the activities of the swamp in ways that helped contextualize for company members the profits or lack thereof of company operations within the swamp. These records can be read, of course, for what the notes reveal and for the numbers, what the numbers reveal about company operations in the 1830s. And I select these records in particular in part because they reveal a significant shift in company prospects right about the time that the nation experienced the Panic of 1837, which was a major series of bank failures in London and then in New York and then in New Orleans, which ultimately led to a recession, which endured well into the early 1840s. Contextualized in that way, we see here records that clearly tell the story of the Dismal Swamp Land Company's halting efforts to find markets for enslaved labor's coerced produce. But upon a closer look, we can see here in some of these records too, the expenses the company paid for pork rations, a particularly salient and traceable ration, which in tracing also the expenses versus which amounts of pork go missing in these records, we can assume to then be exchanged between enslaved labor camps and maroon camps deeper within the swamp. Another set of records includes the Gate County Registrar of Slaves in the Dismal Swamp from 1847 to 1861. The register itself, the product of a series of laws in Virginia and North Carolina that followed Nat Turner's rebellion and that reflect the heightened surveillance state really employed against enslaved people. Contextualized in that way, these records are certainly devices of the state to control the movements and labors of enslaved people. But it's in this ledger and in several other records too that I trace the life of Edmund Booth as the series of a number of entries which describe Edmund Booth to us, itself a way that we can be sure that we're tracing the same person, but also that we can trace the way in which Nathaniel Booth appears in the early pages of the ledger as an enslaved person, in the middle pages of the ledger as said to be a free man, but hired the present year by William B. Whitehead from Nathaniel Booth. Whitehead, of course, an agent for Nathaniel Booth, and then eventually in a series of records that were entered into the Gate County Court later, evidence that Edmund Booth is again enslaved. So why, beyond Dr. Thorpe's clear message that these stories of common people matter, why should we care? In part, I think we care, or at least I did, because abolitionist writers were onto this story too. And these weren't simply people we can cast in the radical Black tradition, or to some degree, the moderate Black tradition of the mid-19th century, including Frederick Douglass, who as early as the late 1840s ran a reprint of an article that appeared in Boston 20 years before, titled Slaves in the Dismal Swamp, and did so in such a way that he sought to contribute to catalog one more example of slavery's long persistence in the Commonwealth of Virginia and in North Carolina, even as increasingly in the same time period, the 1840s especially, the rather famous benign narrative of slavery began to circulate among political circles in the broader South. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the famous novelist, author, of course, of Uncle Tom's Cabin, turned her attention and her inspiration to the story of the Great Dismal Swamp, conflating, of course, the characters in the swamp with characters from elsewhere. Denmark Vesey, for example, is one of the main characters in Dread, but clearly in the subtitle for Dread, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp, using the landscape in particular and white people's relationship to the landscape, their relationship of fear in perceiving the landscape as a grounding narrative device for her readers, who were increasingly, by the late 1850s, ardent and vocal abolitionists. But common men too, like Edmund Jackson, the very much obscure brother of the more famous Boston abolitionist Francis Jackson, also turned his attention to the Great Dismal Swamp in an essay he published in the Liberty Bell in 1852 titled The Virginia Maroons. And whereas Frederick Douglass and others used narrative devices or metaphor to engage in the story of slavery in the Great Dismal Swamp, Edmund Jackson made it very clear in the title the sort of slave experience he saw in the Great Dismal Swamp, and it's an experience of marronage. There's the famous sketch too that appeared in Harper's New Monthly in 1856 of Usman the Maroon, and both the Virginia Maroons and Usman's sketch I return to in just a few moments. To that end, Edmund Jackson's essay made clear in its opening lines that in the West India Islands, but more especially in Jamaica, Cuba, and Santo Domingo, during the reign of slavery, it was common for fugitive slaves to seek shelter and security in the mountainous and secluded portions of those islands. Clearly, that experience of Black resistance throughout the Caribbean seemed to be so for Jackson in the Great Dismal Swamp. David Hunter Strother's experience was different, however. In sketching Usman the Maroon in the swamp, David Hunter Strother was sketching a firsthand experience of having encountered an enslaved person or a maroon in the Great Dismal Swamp. His experience stemmed from a visit to the Great Dismal Swamp and a tour of one of the swamp's canal paths with two enslaved boatmen who described for Strother their experiences of being exploited. Of course, Strother didn't explain it this way, but their experiences of being exploited in the Great Dismal Swamp. And as they're engaging in this visit, Usman emerges. And this is what Strother captures. Strother titles the piece Usman the Maroon in the Swamp. So Strother too is aware of the way in which the history of marronage is an interesting framing device for what he observed. A closer look at the image shows white hair, both in the beard and atop this man's head, and perhaps a face that bears features that show a considerable age. One might assume that Usman had been in the swamp for a number of years, at least in looking at these features. But one might also think about the story of slavery in the swamp and know that most enslaved people were hired into the swamp by enslavers, executing contracts with land companies to send people on an annual basis into the swamp and to retract them at periods of less labor. We might look a bit more closely at Usman's arms and legs and see that they bear a strong muscular feature, clearly the evidence of work in the swamp. We see also that he is clothed perhaps in clothing that is a bit less reflective of an experience outside of the swamp, but we see that he is armed with a long gun, which could have only been sourced from beyond the pale of the swamp's trees. And for what it's worth too, we see Strother's efforts to capture the vegetation and ecology of the Great Dismal Swamp as well, exaggerated as some of these vines, particularly, especially draped over Usman's knee, as these may be. So why does a story like City of Refuge matter? And what can it tell us about the histories of slavery and Black resistance in Virginia and North Carolina, the Virginia South Side, northeastern North Carolina, but perhaps either state more broadly when set into the context of the deep and rich, voluminous scholarship of both states, and the Atlantic world as well, because to understand this story, we also have to engage in the history and scholarship of marronage. What then are the implications for such a story? And how do I see it, and might we consider it, framed in the recent explosion of scholarship that has come out just in our present year? I turned to a few new books that I've begun to read, in part because I'm thinking of new ways to engage the history of Dismal Plantation, and to get even more closely engaged with the experiences of the 60 or so enslaved people who began their experience there in 1763 and 4. Vincent Brown, in his recent book, Tacky's Revolt, explains that attention to, quote, complex patterns of alliance and antagonism over time and of great distance that define relationships between people, Black and white, enslaved and free, helps us to frame more, in more detail even, the ways in which we can better understand the experiences of common people in the 18th century. Brown reminds us too that attention to intertwined life histories he sees as stories of displacement, belonging, and political predicament as he's considering the series of skirmishes and ultimately the war, as he sees it, that was Tacky's Revolt, not simply as evidence of Black resistance, but more importantly, or equally, framed in the context of the 7 Years' War too. Understanding these things together helps us to better understand how diasporic warfare was triggered and how diasporic warfare on either side of the ocean, taken together, created and convulsed the 18th century Atlantic world. That for me is one very long-winded way of saying that even as I engage in Dismal Plantation, as I return to one site in the Great Dismal Swamp, in a new project, I don't see it as separated from the world in which it existed. The historian Jason Sharples, in a recent book, The World That Fear Made, defines as a puzzle in the history of early American slave rebellions, a dissimilarity between the two events that ultimately is a reflection of 20th century scholarly debates about the degree to which a conspiracy scare rose to a level of revolt or insurrection or the like. The framing devices in part in The World That Fear Made are spontaneous uprisings, including the Stono Rebellion, which ravished South Carolina in 1739, or planned, and I place planned in brackets here because really planned is a reflection of the record, but conspiracy that is ultimately coerced from any number of enslaved people through fear in investigations of the prospect of a rebellion is the other end of the spectrum that Sharples reminds us is very important for us to consider, particularly because of the lessons it explains to us about the way that fear operated in slave societies on multiple ends of a spectrum and in multiple directions, from the fear that the state sought to impress upon enslaved people through violence and through other forms of punishment, or the fears that colonials felt against enslaved and free Africans in their midst, particularly in parts of the Atlantic world where population demographics skewed heavily toward people of African descent. So for me, onward to a new project that, as I think about Dr. Thorpe's legacy, I hope at least would make him and my mentors on the screen here proud. I'm invested currently in returning to all forms of evidence that I can bring to bear in an examination of Dismal Plantation, which operated for 30 years or so from the 1760s into the 1790s. Essentially, it was in operation even as the American Revolution produced significant changes in the late British provincial world that produced the early American Republic. And to this end, it's important that I begin engaging more directly the deep and voluminous and frankly intimidating scholarship of the American Revolution, as I also continue with my deep engagement of the histories of slavery and slave resistance. To this end, I've returned to interesting sources, such as an appraisement of Dismal Swamp slaves, penned this copy, this digitized copy, in George Washington's own hand, dated July 4, 1764, just 1 year after the formal close of the 7 Years' War by treaty. Washington himself was trying to keep a good account, or at least have a copy of a good account of the enslaved people who were initially counted to be at Dismal Plantation in 1764. In 1763, these people were mainly comprised of the men on this list, but these men performed next to no labor whatsoever and regularly ran away from the slave labor camp that was to be Dismal Plantation, producing both letters to company members explaining that something needed to be done about this, and also producing in the minds of the members the need to send a number of enslaved women into this site, Dismal Plantation, for the purpose, at least in their minds, of securing the faithful, they would say, labors of the enslaved people at Dismal Plantation. And so a particular interesting note are the names of the women on this appraisal from 1764: Bella, Rachel, Minnie, Nan, Penny, and Molly, and Venus. And also of two children, at least two children, Tony, a boy, and Hannah, a girl. What's also interesting to note are the names of 3 Toms. And in my work so far, I find the Toms interesting because 3 separate runaway advertisements describe the Toms slightly differently, which reveals, at least in the short term of this project, the difficulties of trying to identify who was who, but also revealed to me, at least, John Washington's clear engagement with the project as well. And so for a few final thoughts. The 20th century problems of access to archives and to mainstream publishing outlets that reflected significantly the undergirding logic in Dr. Thorpe's choice to publish his books through private outlets on the one hand, and on the other, that we all remember to be the problem that Dr. John Hope Franklin faced, are in many ways history in and of themselves. I'm delivering this lecture today, sitting on fellowship at the Fred Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon, with pretty good, actually great, I would say, access to the archives here. And I understand that that in and of itself is set against a longer history of scholars, Black scholars particularly, who might not have had, would not have had the same opportunities in the mid-20th century. It is a debt that I can only repay in scholarship that continues to acknowledge the legacy of Black history on the one hand, and also to perhaps contribute in new ways to that history. But I would also note here that the history of Black resistance informs interdisciplinary approaches in valuable ways that Dr. Thorpe himself may have been a pioneer of. Approaches that are now well known and regularly engaged in Africana studies, in gender and women's studies, in archaeology, in anthropology, in sociology, and increasingly in history as well. And I make that second point in part because I understand that there's a generation of scholars, including Ms. Reeves herself, who are engaging in interdisciplinary ways of engaging these histories, such that they produce new knowledge that is plausible and applicable for audiences in a 21st century. I'm increasingly learning too from these same scholars, because I would admit, I am very much trained as a traditional historian, and I owe that in part to my experience at North Carolina Central University. But I think it vitally important for us to understand that the history of Black resistance informs many of these interdisciplinary approaches, and it is invaluable that we echo that here, and that I end this lecture with that note. Thank you so much for your time, for your attention and your interest, and I look forward to engaging in robust discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nevius. We appreciate that wonderful presentation. I'd like to point out that if anyone in the audience would like to ask questions, please place those questions in the chat on the YouTube channel, and then we'll come back to those in a couple of minutes. But first, we're going to hear a message from the Thorpe family.
This is Mrs. Martha Vivian Thorpe, and on behalf of the Thorpe family, she would like to thank Dr. Gershenhorn and the North Carolina Central University History Department for continuing to honor her husband with the annual Early E. Thorpe Memorial Lectures. And this year, she gives additional special thanks to the Association for the Study of African American Life and History for their partnership, and to our speaker, Dr. Marcus Nevius. Thank you very much.
And we're very fortunate today to have Dr. Rita Thorpe Lamb with us, who's one of Dr. Thorpe's daughters. And so I'm going to ask her if she would like to make a few comments.
I just want to say thank you. It's so good to see my mother's comment. She will be 95 this month, 95 years old. Want to thank Dr. Carlson Wilson and of course, Dr. Jerry Gershenhorn, Chairman Jim Harper, and salute to Brittney Reeves and Dr. Percy Murray. We are just so grateful for the continuation, 30 years of honoring my father. So I just want to say thank you. There's so much else. And the message was just so inspiring and encouraging until I made notes, and I'll be doing additional studies, and I'm sure that the other listeners will be as well. So thank you to everyone. That's it.
Dr. Lamb, we appreciate those comments. So now we're open to questions from anyone in the audience, anything related to Dr. Nevius's talk. So far, we have a number of well wishes. We're happy to have a number of our alums in the audience today, including Dr. Nevius's lovely wife, Jahan. I see, what else do I see? Anitra Cole. I'm sure Dr. Murray, one of Dr. Murray's students, I believe. Dr. Brandon Winford, one of our BA MA graduates, who's now a professor, associate professor of history over at the University of Tennessee. Any questions from any of the people who spoke earlier? If I don't know if we have any questions from Dr. Parker, Dr. Murray. I see we have Dr. Lindsay on this with us, Dr. Lamb, Dr. Wilson, Ms. Reeves.
Yes, I have a question. This is Carlton Wilson. Marcus, about the dismal the plantation itself, you know, how long did that plantation exist? When, I mean, you're looking at the a very early period here, but how far into the 19th century was it still in operation?
Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for that question. As far as I was able to trace Dismal Plantation's operations in the pages of City of Refuge, or in my research for City of Refuge, I traced it into the 1790s in its first iteration. I still have some work to do to determine whether or not it continues to operate under different circumstances in the first decades of the 19th century. But for the generation of company agents that I'm following in order to try to understand better the lives of the enslaved people there, I trace them into the 1790s. The company itself, the Dismal Swamp Company, operated under its first iteration until the second decade of the 19th century. But over that time, especially into the 1790s, it began to lose ground in the Great Dismal Swamp as other private outfits, including the Dismal Swamp Land Company, which becomes its second offshoot, but the Dismal Swamp Canal Company and other private operations begin exploiting different parts of the swamp's landscape. And so the short answer is I've traced it into the 1790s. The longer answer is I'm seeking to confirm a late date.
Okay, thank you. We do have a couple of questions now. So the first question from our audience is from Celeste Keith, who's an undergrad and aspiring historian. She says, thank you for your lecture. In the discussion, you mentioned reading into the silence. So she asks, in what ways would the historian do this? What sources did you find most effective in aiding your book's narrative?
That is an excellent, excellent question. Let me foreground my answer by saying there's a number of really, really good books that anyone who seeks to engage in this sort of method should begin with. Marisa Fuentes' book, Dispossessed Lives, for me, was quite beneficial. Dispossessed Lives, of course, is about the experiences or finding the experiences of 17th century enslaved women in Barbados in archives that have very few references, direct references to enslaved people, and then about describing their experiences through building the story of what slavery was in 17th century Barbados. But there are others. Scholars often cite Saidiya Hartman's Venus in Two Acts, Ann Stoller's work, James Scott's work on Southeast Asia. These are reference points in which the scholarship of the last 25 years or so has really built upon a method of not only seeking to read primary sources in order to let the sources speak for themselves, so to speak. That's parlance from the mid to late 20th century, but also to question those sources, to seek to determine what we can plausibly say was happening in those experiences, but that those who wrote the records themselves may not have included directly in the records. And so for me, in this particular work, the most useful sources were actually correspondences between company agents on the one hand and company members on the other, because company agents were almost always attempting to downplay the levels of Black resistance that were happening at places like Dismal Plantation, while they were also trying to explain why Dismal Plantation's ditches were a mess, why Dismal Plantation's crops, first in rice and hemp, failed miserably, and then later in timber products, why those were always so disappointing. And of course, the answer is the enslaved people themselves, they weren't doing this work. They weren't interested in maintaining ditches, which were ultimately a way that their exploitation would be continued. But the agents don't necessarily say that. And so it takes a sort of triangulation of deep study, of secondary scholarship, of others who are using similar approaches, and then learning from that scholarship the ways in which you might frame your own questions as you look at your own sorts of primary sources that you're collecting in your own work.
Thank you. Here's a question from Brandon Winford. Dr. Nevius, would you discuss some of the turning points in your research?
Sure. Hi, Brandon. Brandon and I always had great banter at NCCU, so I appreciate this. This is fun. My story begins in the 1760s in the wake of the 7 Years' War. And it really begins in a context of land speculation in Virginia, right? And exploitation of slave labor in Virginia. The two are one and the same, or not, I shouldn't say one and the same, but they're related in that the reason why the earliest group of enslaved people that I can fully document in the Great Dismal Swamp are they at Dismal Plantation is because the men of George Washington's generation decide to come together to buy plots of land that, of course, Native Americans are still passing through, right, in the South side of Virginia, and to do so in a competition against other landholders in Western Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, such that they can control that land and such that they can project their form of authority and society into that landscape. And then for them, the project is much the same as others who are engaging in the effort to try to establish plantations in the mid-18th century. They're seeking to do two things, essentially. One is to establish a cash crop in that swamp site, and the other is to purchase, acquire, however they are able to, enslaved people to send to that site. Then the American Revolution happens, and a number of people whose records I trace make a number of different decisions about how they're going to engage this time period. George Washington, of course, and John Washington too, become instrumental in organizing Virginia's militias, and Washington, of course, the nation's army in this war against the British Empire. But the enslaved people at Dismal Plantation remain there, and they pass under the oversight of a number of much lesser known company agents, and their resistance increases. And part of what I'm trying to do in this project is to understand by tracing fluctuations in the number of people there, what this actually means, right? City of Refuge, I take into the 19th century. I engage the early Republican period of private company development as one form of state control in that region. And then ultimately the response to that as these companies remain, as the broader story of abolition begins to unfold in the middle decades of the 19th century. And that, of course, I described earlier. But I end the story just before the Civil War, and frankly, with the height of abolitionists' efforts to bring attention to the Great Dismal Swamp. And I do that in part because as historians, we all have to make decisions about how we're going to wrangle our stories into some form of cohesive narrative. But for me, that's the narrative in general and some of the major watersheds.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Aisha Haikal. Can you explore what it means for Duke? Can you explore what it means for Duke University to be the repository for both the Thorpe collection and the Dismal Company records, in particular thinking about archival silences and description?
Wow, that is a fascinating question for which my answer at this stage, I'm sure, will be disappointing, but here goes. I actually thought about that as I was reading Dr. Gershenhorn's biography of Dr. Thorpe and preparing this talk, trying to think about what points I might highlight to bridge the two. My work, of course, and Dr. Thorpe's legacy. I am not sure who made the decision or why it was made for Dr. Thorpe's papers to be housed at Duke. And to this end, perhaps the family, perhaps Dr. Lamb or others may offer some context and some insight there. But I think the short answer would be that there's a great amount of strategic value for a scholar who would like to take forward this idea of Thorpe's legacy and thinking about what it means in relation to the Dismal Swamp Company's records and what they reflect about Southeastern Virginia and Northeastern North Carolina, because you'd be sitting in the same archives. You could go to that same site and engage an archivist in the project of helping you to find what's of interest to you in the Thorpe family's records or in Dr. Thorpe's records, just the same as you could go to an archivist about the Dismal Swamp Company's papers, and you could be in that space and do that. And frankly, Duke University's libraries also offer a number of fellowship opportunities by which you could frame that sort of project. Of course, it would take a lot of thinking to determine how you make that case. But that's one way that I could think that there's a useful implication there.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from another alum, Sherwin Bryant, who's actually also, well, he got a BA at NCCU, but he got his grad degrees at Ohio State as well. And he is teaching, where is he teaching? Teaching at Northwestern. Yeah, and so he asks, he says, I enjoyed the talk a great deal. Can you speak to the ways that the company's operations apply to other areas in coastal North Carolina?
Yes. So interestingly, Dr. Bryant, hello, by the way. The Dismal Swamp Company and the Dismal Swamp Land Company were but two of many land companies or canal companies, these outfits that in many cases bear a number of the same members. I'm thinking, for example, of George Washington's efforts to establish the Dismal Swamp Company, but to then divest himself of direct involvement in it in the 1780s, only to turn his attention to a number of other potential land schemes, such as the Potomac Company, which comes into existence in the late Revolutionary era, or the Chesapeake and Ohio Company. I know those are west of the coast. But the Dismal Swamp Canal Company becomes the major company, at least as it's related to the Dismal Swamp, that really facilitates the effort to cut what is today the Dismal Swamp Canal. And this takes shape over about 30 years from the 1790s in 3 stages into the 1820s, such that now there's a major waterway that is sometimes included in discussions of the intercoastal waterway in the region on the swamp's eastern fringe. It was later deepened, of course, I believe by the United States Engineering Corps in the World War II era and perhaps after, such that today you can enter the North Carolina Dismal Swamp State Park on the southeastern side of the swamp and walk right up to the Dismal Swamp Canal. Or you can drive your favorite small watercraft to a boat slip and then jump into a boat and ascend up and down the Dismal Swamp Canal. I'm on much less well thought ground here, Dr. Bryant, but I'm also thinking that there's a real story here that begins with the sort of companies that are the Dismal Swamp Company and the Dismal Swamp Land Company, which help us to understand state formation in Virginia and in North Carolina in the 19th century. And I'm thinking here of a recent book that tells a similar story about South Carolina. The author's name escapes me at the moment, but I can see the cover. But anyway, I'd have to get back to you in a separate conversation for more on that.
Okay, very good. We have another question from Aisha Haikal. As some of you may know, next year's theme for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History is the Black family. So she asks, in your scholarship, how did the Black family show up, or did the Black family show up in your research?
That's a very, very important question. In the way that I framed City of Refuge, it was difficult for me to engage with family per se for two reasons. The first is that the book is mainly based in the company records with some reference to other forms of sources that help me to better understand and contextualize the company records on the one hand. And then on the other hand, I was not necessarily writing a family-oriented history, in part because there are so many good family-oriented histories of the region. I'm thinking of Warren Miltier's recent works on the counties near the swamp in the northeastern part of North Carolina. But I would say that there is at least one very well-known family in the region. It's Moses Grandi's family, whose efforts, even to this day, are very, very vital in helping us to remember this story of slavery and the story of resistance in the region. And I have met colleagues who were just as recently as a couple years ago working on a sort of public history based on interviews with that family and with other families in the region to try to develop a grassroots sense of a more recent history of the Black experience in that region too. And those colleagues were operating out of the University of California at Berkeley at the time. They are now spread about the nation, and some of that work is actually coming to bear recently. I'm thinking here of my good colleague, Catherine Golden, who is now at the University of Delaware, among others who have taken up some of that work too.
Okay, thank you. I believe that may be our last question I see at this point. I'd like to, before we end, I'd like to encourage everybody to go out and buy Dr. Nevius's excellent book, City of Refuge, to learn more about some of the topics he's been discussing today. And I want to thank, first of all, of course, Dr. Nevius for his excellent presentation. In previous years, we'd all invite you to have something to eat and something to drink, and we could talk more, but unfortunately, this is not a usual year. So hopefully we'll be able to do that again next year. I want to thank, once again, the Thorpe family for their support over the years. And I want to thank all of our speakers today from NCCU. And I want to particularly thank the Association for the Study of African American Life and History because I think this has been a great opportunity for NCCU and ASALH to partner and to, put this thing out on YouTube so people can watch it who weren't able to watch it live. And finally, as all of you know, please, if you haven't done so, go out and vote. In North Carolina, or in Durham, if you live in Durham, North Carolina, they have an excellent website for early voting. You can check early voting and they'll tell you exactly the wait time for early voting in any of the various early voting spots. So thank you all to our audience. Dr. Nevius, you should check some of the comments. You got tremendous praise from many of your classmates as well as a number of alum. And even I see one of your professors, Dr. Phil Rubio, who's watching as well. We heard from Miss Moore. She's so proud of you. So you have tremendous support and it's well deserved. So thank you all, and I hope you have a pleasant rest of your Sunday.
This is Art History.
This is our legacy.
This is NCCU's History Department.
This is North Carolina Central University's Department of History.